The Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF, is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs on inclusive housing, mental health research, as well as book club and library for inclusive literature. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we also want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, WIO, which is the media partner, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not be possible. Now on to today's session. The session is on Beyond Boundaries, the Body and Non-Conformity with Bishakh, Angshu Dasgupta, Aparna Upadhyaya Sanyal, which will be moderated by Sai, who is a criminologist and works on accountable policing and incarceration systems in India. She's actively engaged with the transgender movement and is passionate about the issues of trans people in conflict with law.
Thank you so much, Sanjana, for the introduction. I'll be taking it over and firstly welcome everybody to this panel on Beyond Binaries. We will be starting off the session with an introduction of all the panelists that we have alphabetically. Aparna Upadhyaya Sanyal is the author of Circus, Folk and Village Freaks, which explores the absurd and the bizarre with witty undertones through tales of transmogrification of men to monsters, animals to women, speaking truths of various lives and their travesties. Angshu Dasgupta has always been a reader. He's fascinated by the meaning of words and the way they're put together. He studied electronics at IIT Kharagpur and works as a computer programmer. We have Bishakh. Bishakh has appeared in the New Yorker in We Are Still Here, the first all-trans comic anthology, Beyond 2, the queer post-apocalyptic and urban fantasy comics anthology, The Strumpet, the Boston Review, and much more. Her graphic novel, Apsara Engine, is out now from the feminist press. Her graphic memoir, Spellbound, will be published by Street Noise Books in August 2020. Firstly, thank you everybody for agreeing to be on this panel. This is a very diverse and rich set of panelists that we have this time. I will directly delve into the questions that I had already talked to you about. Now, the first question that I will be asking is from Angshu. So Angshu, could you tell us what are the ways in which established binaries or the very notion of binaries have impacted your process of writing?
I'll just start with the binary of self and the other, right? The boundary of where myself ends and the other begins. And I've always been fascinated with that because as a child, I was a liar, right? I used to make stuff up all the time. And I would tell people that my name is, for example, Wasim Akram, for no reason. I mean, absolutely no reason to tell that lie, but I would. So there's always been this propensity to want to be somebody or something that I apparently am not, right? Ultimately, this is why I started writing fiction in the first place, because in our heads are several people that we want to be, but we can't always be, right? So when you write fiction, you are sort of set free from the boundaries of yourself, and then you can be whoever you wish to be on the pages of the book that you're writing. And that, I think, is it's the inciting, what should I say? Inciting event as far as my journey into writing fiction is concerned.
Thank you so much, Angshu. That actually borrows into the next question that I was talking about. That is, I felt that historical fiction, that is fiction that is set up in a distant or near past, has an impact on reimagining parts of history that couldn't possibly have been recorded. The context of this question is also reading books such as Shadow Princess by Indu Sundares and various other aspects of queerness which have been brought about by a number of authors, number of different ways in which it has been expressed. What are your thoughts about it, writing historical
See,
fiction in this context?
I can only comment on it uh, uh, from the perspective of the process of writing my own first novel,
Yes.
which is set, in the not so distant past. It's set in the 1980s and the 1990s. And there's a reason, again, that basically speaks to the question itself. I mean, why? I mean, how does it help us reimagine? You know, now the thing here is that uh, to fully answer, I'd probably need to go back to the 1980s a little bit. So the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 90s is when, liberalization happened, and there was MTV, and on MTV there was, uh, you know, people like Freddie Mercury or Boy George or Katie Lang or Tracy Chapman, and suddenly people who found themselves in middle class urban Indian households, growing up in boxes that they uh, didn't think they could ever break out of, suddenly were filled with a sense of both hope and despair. Hope because you see that you don't really need to be in that box forever, and despair because all of it is so far away. Right? So it is this sense of hope and despair that I try to deal with in the novel.
Yeah.
And that's again why I chose to stay in the 80s and 90s, because if I were to bring it to the present day, okay, just to give you a little bit of background, the protagonist of my novel is a boy, and it follows this boy's life between the ages of 10 and around 16. So this boy thinks when he was very little, he thought he was going to grow up and become exactly like his mother. His mother's gone, so he imagines himself as a grown-up, and what he sees is his mother. And that's a strange place for a boy to be, especially in the 1980s and 90s. So if this boy were to grow up today, then probably he would not have as hard a time as he did, right? And but at the same time, that sense of hope and despair, right? That would still be the same. He would still hope to one day be able to break out the box that he finds himself in, and the despair that it's all very distant, and it doesn't seem to be accessible, this whole process of becoming, right? And setting it then and having people read it now uh, has basically brought me to the conclusion that human emotions, in spite of everything that changes across time, because this is I'm talking about almost 40 years ago, 35 to 40 years ago, this novel is set. Human emotions remain the same. Our struggles remain the same. Our aspirations, the conflicts that are within us, they remain the same. And so that helps us reimagine why the past, even the future, because we know that, this is us. This is what makes us human. The hope, the despair, the strife, the endeavor to become ourselves finally.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think also the fact that you said if the boy was living in today's age and time, most probably would have a very different journey. So helps people also relate to like how our journeys are varied over space and time so drastically, but at the same time, our emotion that we can commonly connect to. Thank you so much, Angshu. We will now speak to Bishakh specifically. Bishakh, the first question that I have for you is that graphic representation and art have emerged as a medium of expression and resistance. What have been the contours you have had to navigate in this medium specifically?
Okay, great. And also thank you for having me as part of this event. It's really an honor to be amongst you all. So what are the contours that I've had to navigate? I guess, you know, doing comics and writing graphic novels as a sort of evolution of drawing comics has always been a part of my life. I've always been drawing. It's only, I sort of got put on a detour in my youth because, I mean, culturally speaking or whatever, my folks didn't think that was a serious sort of career path or you know, whatever. So I've always been drawing, but it never occurred to me that it could become something more serious until fairly recently when I quit my job. I used to be an architect, and I quit my job in a sort of moment of frustration and decided to see if I could make a go of doing work as a graphic novelist and take myself seriously and take the work seriously. And it was sort of a gamble, you know, trying to overcome my own training, my own education in a way to see if like what I thought I was good at was good enough to propel myself into another career. So that, you know, that's where I found myself fairly recently. And while all that was happening, I was also coming to terms with who I was as a person in terms of gender. So it was sort of a confluence of trajectories that met at this one certain point in my life. And I think the practice of drawing, the practice of writing together as a graphic novelist was something that allowed me to realize and to reckon with my own gender. So, you know, becoming trans for me was a process that was abetted by the practice of being a graphic novelist. And this is something that I address in a book that's coming out in August called Spellbound, which is coming out from Street Noise Books, which is a sort of, well, it's been called a meta memoir or a displaced memoir in the sense that when I first started writing it, I really didn't want to draw myself just because I thought it was a little too self-obsessed, even though it was a memoir. But I wanted to create a sort of distance, so I substituted a character in place of me, who was a cisgendered Bengali American woman. But little did I know that that was sort of a harbinger, like a portal for me to eventually realize that she was me, you know. But as the book developed, there was also a kind of distance that developed between us that reappeared. Anyway, it became a very tangled, convoluted story, but I think it's it's an interesting book. But so yeah, that's a long sort of recounting of how I came to be where I am now. But I don't know. I think the culture of comics and graphic novels was something I was a little apprehensive of at first. You know, conventions and the sort of it seemed to be dominated at some point when I first started doing graphic novels and comics by a lot of a sort of culture of a very kind of bro-y culture, like lots of dudes, right, who kind of dominated the scene, and people like me, you know, femmes, people of color, South Asian folks seem to be underrepresented, if at all. I mean, most of the time we were absent. I think that's changed a lot recently, and I think there's much more of a welcoming atmosphere for queer, trans, South Asian folks who are creating comics and graphic novels. So I don't know, I think I've found myself in a happy place after however many years of sort of floundering and not knowing who I was or what I was doing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bishakh. Just from there, actually, talking about how in the recent past is when you have seen a lot of affirmation to a certain extent in the comic circles, which was not non-existent previously. The next question is, in the present political context also, what do you think is the relevance of affirmative imagery and representation of people from the margins? And the context of this question is also that many a times the way in which marginalization also functions in public opinion is creating this demonized and version of that person, you know, highlighting, for example, trans people and trans bodies have been ridiculed and have been shown as something emasculating as compared to it being a valid gender in itself. So would you want to pitch in?
Sure. Sure. I guess the work that I do questions the idea of the margins, in the sense that it, you know, assuming margins also assumes a center, right? And that center is sort of cisgendered, white, patriarchal society. And I guess what I've been trying to do, either consciously or unconsciously, is to decenter that presumed center, right? So most of my work involved, you know, most of the protagonists or characters in my work are of some either specific or nebulous South Asian background, and a lot of them are either explicitly queer or trans, or are characters who are finding their own queerness somehow or unearthing it. So by default, all the stories are centered on people who one would, for lack of a better way of putting it, you would characterize as marginal. But since they're now centered, they're not marginal anymore. So it almost, without making a manifesto of it, I think my work just sort of quietly puts these characters back in the spotlight and says, these are stories worth telling. And this is a way of affirming who we are without having to make a declaration of it, you know? And so as far as like trans bodies go and stories about trans folks, again, I think there's a sort of initial assumption in my work that one doesn't have to apologize or preface one's transness, you know? Like the character is trans and is already in the story and is doing stuff that other characters would be doing without having to introduce themselves as who they are, you know? They just are trans and they're just living their lives. Sometimes the stories are focused on their trans identity and sometimes they're not, you know? So I think just the act of having characters who are, that you don't normally see in mainstream comics or literature, having those characters in there in the first place, unapologetically living their lives, is a sort of radical act. And I think that's the way I have been approaching my work in terms of how these trans bodies and queer bodies are part of a world that isn't necessarily centered in the same way that we find ourselves. I mean, I think that, you know, the axis is shifting a bit in 2020 for better and worse. And those centers, I think, maybe are disappearing or dissipating on their own. So I think even the notion of margins is becoming sort of problematized in with what's happening now. And I think my work, the stories that I write, inadvertently or not, have tapped into that sense of the margins becoming less marginal and also inhabiting other multiple centers.
Thank you so much, Bishakh, for that. I think immediately go on to Aparna from here. Aparna, so the first question that I would like you to answer is, so blurring the lines between binaries has been a way of expressing deep humanistic and political realities, from Orwellian literature to Kafka. How has this channeled into your own work? Yes.
So first off, I just want to say hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. Team Belong, Wire, everybody. I'm so grateful, so honored, and completely overawed by my other panelists, by the co-panelists. You guys do such stellar work, and fantastic. So just give you a quick one line about the book so that you know what I'm speaking about. My book, Circus Folk and Village Freaks, was released in late 2018. It's actually 18 short stories, but they're written in rhyme, mostly metered. And the book went on to do pretty well in India. My second book is hopefully out next year, and there will be a big announcement about that soon. So, so the book was described by many people as having a lot of tales of, as you said earlier, Sai, about the transmogrification from human to animal. And for me, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to talk about it in the same line as, say, Kafka's Metamorphosis or The Animal Farm. And the parallels are actually quite predominantly viewable in the book. So I have a character, the first story in the book deals with the character of a crocodile man called Subramaniam. And if you look at, say, the character of Gregor Samsa in Metamorphosis, and how we speak about the sudden and acute loss of agency that happens the minute that he is transformed. The tale of Subramaniam, the crocodile man, is basically of a man who transforms into a crocodile, and how, because of this transformation, he is deified by the village around him and primarily by his wife. And there is a temple constructed around him, and his life is not his own anymore. So even though there is an outwardly upping of his stature and his socioeconomic income, there is a complete and total loss of personal agency. And I think that is where I've been very influenced by works such as The Metamorphosis, is because how the character of Subramaniam is almost erased in becoming nothing but a mirror for people in front of him to be able to project their own hopes and desires and their ideals of normative behavior, whether it's heterosexual normative behavior, whether it is any bodily ideals of behavior. So, and here's the really amazing part, is that after most people read the book, I was asked this question repeatedly of, wow, you actually saw a crocodile. And my reply to everyone was that no, Subramaniam never became a crocodile. Subramaniam was simply a man who was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and had a mental breakdown. And he started behaving like a crocodile. What did happen though was society around him was so uncomfortable with the break in normative behavior that he displayed, that they portrayed or they deified him for that. The same way in India, we have so many people that are deified just for exhibiting characters that we seem to say are not falling into normal patterns of behavior. Now, there's another story in my book which is about an elephant man. He's a man who's tragically born with deformities and a sickness that makes tumors appear, and his face is actually melting. And he lands in the circus. And the story is about how he finds love only within himself, because he is seen as so outside the binary by most people that he is taken to his most base form by others, not by himself. So I think that is another way that you can draw the parallel between the work of somebody like Kafka. When we come to something like The Animal Farm, there's a very incredible, I think I even wrote it down. I said all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And this one of the stories in my book speaks about class hierarchy and class binaries, right? And how the upper echelons of these class hierarchies, and how they're very set in believing that there cannot be an existence beyond these binaries, and how a lot of people are willing to undertake personal losses just to reinforce these binaries today very much. Not even, I'm not even speaking about tribal India, I'm not speaking about even suburban, I'm not even speaking about rural India, I speak about urban India. That the binaries of gender normative, of class normative are so grouted into our very being that we still cannot go beyond those. In one of my stories, there was it was very strange, because 6 months after my book came out, the story that I'd written about was actually a newspaper article. There was a gentleman a Brahmin gentleman whose son I think he needed a kidney transplant, but the only kidney donor was from a backward community, or what we call Harijans, or the untouchable caste, as they are called. And he chose to not undergo the transplant because he believed that that would go so much beyond that binary of class, that he was unwilling to take that. And this was actually written in my book 6 months before this article appeared in real life. So I think that speaks a lot about the Orwellian form of literature, which actually speaks a lot about caste hierarchies. So yeah, I think that should answer.
Thank you so much. Also, like how this topic reality is that when we talk about fiction, there doesn't really need something more to make it this topic. I think reality itself just feels very apocalyptic in its core. Okay, so the next question from there also, because you were talking about the representation of characters in your work as animals and how that relates to Orwell and Kafka. So what are your influences specifically from nature and ecology when you talk about your work, or when you in the process?
Sure. So before I became a writer, I was an I was avidly into following design, studying design, and I was absolutely fascinated with anything to do with zoomorphism. So even design, it was always the work that kind of twisted reality around in such a way that, and whether it was mythologies that dealt with animal gods, whether it was any designs, any artists who chose to incorporate animal design, whether it was surrealism by like Dali or any of the masters, I was always fascinated by that. And I realized I am very fascinated by the binary that exists of between man and beast, because I believe that each and every one of us is away from our beast behavior by only the amount of privilege that we all experience when we live. So honestly, if you take away the layers and layers of privilege that I live with today, I would probably behave like my beast self, which would be basic, survival of the fittest, Darwinian in nature. So I guess that was where I was coming from, because so many of the stories in my book speak about the true and pure animal nature of a human being. And I think my own struggles with mental health have colored my writing a great deal. In fact, my next book also deals with mental health, sexuality, and again, going beyond binary. So sophism has been tremendous. I also find it fascinating to make the connection, to make the differences, to look at the differences between cold-blooded and warm-blooded. Us being the mammals, warm-blooded, capable of more, sentient emotion, etc. Whereas you think of a cold-blooded person or animal as being that which lives at a base level. And I love to kind of play with those posits, which I think are again very they layered onto us. And I believe each and every one of us at the base can be as human as reptile, and maybe that's why it comes across in a story like Jiva the Elephant Man. Sorry, not Jiva the Elephant Man, but Shiva the Snake Man, where I speak about a man who has such an incredible affinity to snakes and anything reptilian that at some point in his life he starts developing a skin condition where his skin starts scaling. And even though people he's examined by so many doctors and so many dermatologists, nobody can find anything wrong with him. It's just that incredible empathy and affinity that man feels translates into changing his face, the same way so many people say that dogs start to look like their owners, and vice versa, owners start to look like their dogs. It's almost that kind of transference of empathy that leads to almost like a leeching of characters from one to the other. I think I'm really fascinated by that, even in mythology, whether it is werewolves, whether it's called, there's a word for it, it's clinical lycanthropy, which is basically a man turning into a werewolf, and so many systemic beliefs that we've had over the ages of human beings being able to transmute into animals and back. And I think I think the book deals with a lot of that just because I'm fascinated by it. I also, because I've lived with having to exist in a fat body my entire life, and wanting to go beyond, for me actually, as Bishakh was saying earlier, just loving myself has been the most radical form of revolution that I myself have done, because just being able to love my body for what it is. Because living in a fat body in India, in being a young girl living in a fat body in suburban India, has been kind of like one of my biggest struggles, and it has added to my mental health issues. So I think all of that, my unwillingness to fit into normative ideals of what a girl in India should look like, plays into my idea of humans being able to transform into their animal selves, and that is what is written into the book. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll actually open this up for approximately 15 minutes, 5 minutes each speaker, to make any concluding points or to respond to anything that the other panelists have said. So I'll start and go back to Angshu. Angshu, do you have anything to add, or any comments, reflections from the conversation that has been happening?
Yeah, I was sort of the idea of that Bishakh expressed, that centering the story around characters who seem to, would otherwise in normative literature appear as marginal. That's, I think, a pretty radical thing to do. And to some extent, I've tried to do that in my work too. I've tried to put this young boy who is not really like the other boys, although not in a very radical way. He just wants to grow up and be like his mother, and call that what you mean. But I've tried to, deal with the regular emotions that this boy has in dealing with friends, or in dealing with the usual pressures of growing up, like choosing a career, etc., and how that interplays with his sense of being someone that, sense of being that someone that the world doesn't see him as. So yeah, that I think it's something that whose time has come to center powerful stories around people who the mainstream looks upon as marginal. I think the time has come for that.
Bishakh, over to you.
I was really interested in what Aparna was saying about talking about transmogrification, because I have a couple of instances of that in my book, Apsara Engine, and I've been trying to process what those moments of transmogrification mean for me, and I think the only thing I can come up with is I think I've got some sort of interest in the question of, or the notion of the hybrid. And I'm still exploring that, and I'm not sure it's going or how that relates to, I mean, I don't want to make a direct connection to queerness, but that's something I'm still working out. But I'd also, Aparna, what you were saying about the thin line between beastliness and humanity it reminds me of when I was in architecture school, and we took a seminar in which the professor put out the idea that the idea of the animal is the opposite of architecture. So our challenge was to retrieve the animal nature and see where we could go within architecture with that idea. I'm not sure that we ever found the answer, because I don't think there is an answer. I'm not even sure if there's a question, but I thought it was interesting because, you can clearly see the sort of the dual nature, or the sort of blurred line between our sense of who we are as a species, in terms of how we're civilized or not, and the idea of the animal or becoming a beast. But I think there's all sorts of other weird binaries, like between being animal and being architecture, that I don't know, that start to like do things to your head. So anyway, hybridity, what does it mean? I don't know.
Aparna, would you like to contribute?
That is fascinating, Bishakh. You've given me a lot to think about. Who's the architect that made the? My memory is like a sieve. The structure in Spain, I forget.
Calatrava.
Sorry.
Calatrava.
Possibly, I forget now. But you start thinking about expanding yourself. Yes, actually, beyond human to architecture. That is fascinating. How we actually grout parts of ourselves into buildings. And I don't want to give anything away because I've just started working on it. But it's actually what the third book that I'm writing right now is going to be dealing with, is the little porosity of structures, and how possibly there is an interchange and an interplay of emotions between us and the structures we live within. And I think it's fascinating, and I really would love to chat more with you sometime about that, Bishakh. And I did actually have a question to both of the co-panelists was, Bishakh, is Apsara Engine available? I'd love to get a copy. Is it available in India? That's my question.
I think it just became available on Amazon India.
Awesome. And Angshu, yours is available as well, right?
Yes, it's from Speaking Tiger. It's available. It's available on as a hardback,
Amazon?
as well as and it's also on the Kindle.
Awesome, that's great. Sai, so going back to speaking about binaries, I think what we need to do is get away from comparing anything that doesn't form, that doesn't come under our so-called normative ideas and ideals that we live with. It shouldn't be construed as being dark. So a lot of people came at me when I was reviewed in the Hindu. Actually, somebody actually said we had to get past all the bonking in the book to actually realize that, oh, it's pretty well written. another person said, oh, she just goes all out and does Brahmin bashing. And continuously, I do have people reviewing me and saying, we liked it, but it was a bit dark for us. Now, my point is, what is dark? If you are unwilling to actually explore that part within your own nature that exists within each and every one of us, whether it is each and every part of us that is a certain percentage of male, a certain percentage of female, as we all know now, gender is a spectrum. But if I am more willing to explore more of the other side of the spectrum, why is that construed as me being dark? Or me choosing, I'm not choosing to, a lot of people say that we don't understand what you're saying. And, you know, your parents must have done something wrong. I mean, look at you. I mean, how can you have such dark thoughts coming out of your head? And my point is that all of us have that hidden within ourselves. The extent of the binaries is actually from one end of your brain to the other end of your brain. It's all in there. It just is a matter of how much you're willing to tap into and explore. So whether it is my gender, whether it is my sexuality, whether it is my state of being, go beyond those norms that are construed as here to here, male to female, you know, good to bad, animal to human. Anything that goes beyond that is construed as dark or subversive or revolutionary. And I think we need to remove all of those and kind of normalize this as just being a part of us. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aparna. Actually, like one thought that I was having, I've had this conversation multiple times with people. And the problem with describing all of this as spectrums is that spectrums still have extreme binaries.
Correct.
Like spectrums exist as a diversification of a binary still.
Correct.
So the only way to talk about it, I feel like, is maybe this cloud where you don't know where it begins and where it ends. And
Absolutely.
everybody just exists within it without having to have
to
a
be
location.
Yes, to be within.
They just are, right? You know.
That's
yeah.
Would be
The
wonderful,
joys,
wouldn't it?
the joys of simply existing,
Absolutely.
I think, have been lost these days, and everybody has to exist as something and live out historical trauma every day. With that, I think we come to a conclusion of the questions that I have for everyone. But we have a lot of questions from the audience, many of which are quite interesting. So I will go one by one and ask them out, and as brief as you can possibly be regarding the questions, the more questions we'll be able to cover. So this is just something for everybody to keep in mind. So the first question that we have is from Radhika Rajiv, who asks, language and words in themselves cannot be gendered or labeled as queer. A piece of literature written in any language cannot be called queer. At the same time, it is the study of queer literature that has brought awareness and washing away of age-old inherent prejudices. How do you see this canonization of literature? Does it help or create more divisions and discriminations?
Not sure I understand the question, but I think I get the gist of it. And if the question is, does categorizing literature that is written by queer people as queer create divisions, then yes and no. I mean, yeah, because we want to create a space for ourselves. But that, I don't think that leads to fracturing or, chaos. It leads to us just being able to say that this space is our own, you know? So just as people, as people who have colonized land claim it for their own, and that leads to sort of other people being forced off the land. The people who are forced off the land have to claim or create their own land, their own little spaces. And I think that's what literature that is, that you can call queer does for queer people. It creates a space within which we can exist as ourselves. So no, I don't think it creates fractures and divisions, but if it creates homes, I think.
So the next question that we will be looking at, I think the question has been asked specifically to Bishakh, but I think everybody will be able to contribute to a certain extent. So the idea of center that was discussed earlier. So how do you think, the question is, how do you think cis writers, artists should go about the process of being more inclusive and diverse in their own work without appropriating lived realities? This has been asked by Zinia Sen Gupta. So could we talk about maybe the center in the margin context and look at how people from the center, so to say, can write about without appropriating?
I can, if I may, I can. Hi, Zinnia. First of all, I know Zinnia. She's also a very talented writer herself. So I think for me, the thin line between appropriation um, and you know, interpreting somebody else's reality is one that all writers have to constantly travel. But since it's not possible for one person to be all realities and all types and all things at once, I think what you need to do is rely a lot on your lived experience and try to keep the core of your experience as the core of the pain you felt, or the core of the maturity that you've reached, or the life lessons that you've learned, I think are the same, uh, whether they are of your struggles as a person of color, whether they are of being part of the LGBTQA community, whether they are, so for example, with me, a person with mental health issues, and how we are seen as, when you know, you look at other people. So that sense of otherness that is created is what is universal to each and every one of us, I think. So even though each of us is other in a different way, that feeling that's created within us is that feeling that I tap into when I write a story about, say, a queer character. Even though it's not a lived experience for me, I try to be very mindful to the fact that this is a character. And of course, you do your research, you speak to people, you try and understand, and you do try and observe a lot more before you write, before you chronicle anybody else's pain, anybody else's story. So yeah, it's a fine line. Bishakh, would you, Angshu, I'll hand it over.
I guess this is a really fraught question because I think on the one hand, writers of all stripes and varieties, but mainly those from the center, are saying that writers should be able to write whatever they want because that is the project of writing. You know, you should be able to write in the voice of someone that you're not, and that's your privilege as a writer. On the other hand, I think people from the sort of characters that are being written about, for example, queer characters or trans characters, not characters, writers, often feel that people who aren't queer or trans get it really wrong when they write about us. And so there's this feeling amongst us that, you know, people should not just stop doing that, right? Like, so just to talk about film for a moment, but you can extend this to literature, you know, films about trans people by cis people are often really, you know, you can see that this is coming from a very cis lens, right? Like films like The Danish Girl or whatever are all about coming out. They're all about the sort of spectacle of transness. You know, I think very few trans people are interested in that kind of performative film, right? It's like, we just want to see ourselves being who we are. We don't want this spectacle of coming out. So having said that, you know, there are two sides of the question, but where I'm coming from, I think you should trust queer and trans people to tell their own stories and just kind of let us do that. And I know that problematizes the whole project of writing as an act of imagination. I think I think we need to clear quite a few historical before we can get to the point where everyone can imagine themselves to be anyone else and not step on anyone's toes.
May I just That's something that I try to I've been thinking about it a lot myself. And would you also say it would be the same way if there is a queer character in your cast of characters, or how would it then be possible so then I could not say that anybody who has not faced manic depression or major depressive disorder should be able to write about that. That's where that whole, it becomes very, and at the end of the day, it is fiction as opposed to, say, a memoir, which is a lived experience. So I guess, we as writers, as artists, do have to be able to play around and distort reality to the extent that it meets the needs of the piece of fiction as well, as long as you're careful and sensitive.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can I say something here, though? Often, for people like me who look like me, speak like me, dress like me, it's difficult to. You face a lot of criticism for writing about a boy who wishes to grow up to be his mother. And what I'd like to say here is that assumptions are made from both directions about people based on how they look and how they conduct themselves and the lives they lead. And of course, there's a difference in, like Bishakh said earlier, the center and the margins. And the point I'm trying to make here is that we don't know what goes on in the minds of people who write stories. And I think we should just judge the story on whether it seems real or whether it seems like someone just, threw together a bunch of tropes to make the work seem more inclusive.
Thank you so much, Angshu. Actually, this has fit into a perfect sequence right now, because the next question that we have, I think I will pose it back to Angshu to start speaking about it, and then maybe the other panelists can respond. This is with specific context to the J.K. Rowling posting regarding trans issues recently. So in that context, the person asks, what do you feel about the artist, in this case writer, being separate from their art? Especially when the artist is being called out for being problematic or criticized, then how does the art become separate from the artist is a question that they have asked.
Okay, that's a big question, because you see, in recent years we have, for example, I really loved Woody Allen, right? I watched him growing up, and when there were revelations about his conduct with what I'm talking about, right? I was in a bit of a bad spot. Like I really loved some of his films, and at the same time, this is a really problematic man. I mean, so what do I do? Of course, I can't bring myself to watch his films anymore, but the memory of having watched them and having liked them, that still remains. And it's the same case with Harry Potter, right? The memory of the work remains. Now, the important question here is, so then for someone who hasn't read Harry Potter yet, so do they read it or not? Yeah. Right? And I think that's a choice that's best left to the reader, because I think, for example, Tolstoy, right? We read Tolstoy, but we again know his proclivities. Right?
Yeah.
It's important to separate the artist from the art, in my opinion.
I honestly am very, very confused, and I wish I had more clarity on the topic. I don't.
Okay. Bishakh, do you want to pitch in?
I kind of don't want to give more airtime to Rowling, but I, I guess what I will say is that what's encouraging is that fans of that series, especially trans fans of the books, are embracing aspects of it and making it their own, and separating the author from the work. So they're sort of co-opting characters and saying there are, these characters have been a formative part of our childhoods or histories. So we're going to hang on to those, but we can see the possibilities in the work that are that don't necessarily have a direct connection to the author. I don't know how I feel about the subject. I don't know if I think it's possible to completely divorce the two things, but I think there are ways in which you can make it your own. And I think that's what a lot of younger trans fans of the Potter series are doing. So I think that's a good thing.
It would probably be fascinating to see Rowling's reaction to trans fanfic, if there is any. It would probably be interesting.
Maybe not. but but I actually have something to add here personally. I feel like what happens is many a times it's difficult to differentiate between the art and the artist, because the art is also resource, right? It sells. It's something that generates money, has an economy built around it. And as long as that is actively happening, I think disassociating the art from the artist basically means you're supporting still the artist, right? So, for example, the merchandise that this particular person in question has been selling, or the movies, there is an economy to it, and that money is going to go into issues, as has already been spelled out multiple times, of sticking to the stands that have been taken that are problematic. So then it becomes a question about at what time and space does the art become separate from the artist. I think we need to also look at that as an issue, maybe. Now, okay, I think we'll go on to the next question now. And again, once again, I will leave this open to anybody to take it up. But so the question is by Viveka Gurung, who asks, can we achieve a gender-neutral ground of living our lives when we still depend heavily upon the language that is born of the institution of patriarchy? Is there a way we manufacture our new words and phrases to accommodate the idea of non-binary lifestyle that we are trying to promote?
Well, I think people are already doing that in terms of, I'll speak for the English language here. People are non-binary and gender non-conforming folks are already creating their own pronouns and adopting other gender-neutral pronouns to identify who they are. And I think that as a practice is becoming more prevalent in our society. We saw that, they or them have become the word of the year. And Merriam-Webster. So yeah, I think that's already happening. And I think in terms of language, that's going to become, that's going to evolve into an even more complex pattern of words and language. And it'll become, it won't happen right away, but I think there's going to be a process of complication, but also accommodation that is going to become more and more natural, but it's only thanks to folks who are demanding their own pronouns that this is going to happen.
Just a small comment over here. I also think this this creating of these extremes of binary and non-binary and them not being able to survive subsequently, I think is also a problem. Then what happens is, like, people who identify with binary gender in any way, I think all binary, non-binary identities, everything will fit into a cloud, but maybe not a spectrum. as I was earlier saying. Anybody else?
And then you'll have people like Jordan Peterson pushing back against all of that. And yeah.
Speaking specifically of language in India, I think we need to, there's a lot of overturning that needs to be done, not just of the patriarchy, but we're still like an entire generation, all generations of us are still feeling the after effects of colonization. And so it's not just the patriarchy that needs to be dismantled very, over the centuries, but also that post-colonial, hangover that we still have. So, for example, I or most of my colleagues at this level feel that, our unfortunate usage of English, or not unfortunate, sorry, that's the wrong usage, but that we have not really become as conversant in our own tongue from where we come. And unfortunately, there is no language of dissent in our own tongue. So, for example, at least there is a different pronoun in English that is now there, as you said, they, them. But Hindi or any of the bhashas or in any of the several languages we speak are a long way from in any way acknowledging that there exists differences that need to be addressed outside of the patriarchy. I think we're still very far away, specifically speaking about India.
I have a small comment to add over there. Actually, in Indian languages, there are a number of languages which do not confine themselves to binary
binaries, correct,
or don't
correct.
necessarily gender everything.
Absolutely.
Right? Bangla is one of them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There is a necessity that some languages.
Yes.
Also, there has been a historical analysis of this to look at which languages actually enforce the idea of gendering each and everything, right from inanimate objects to animate objects. Right. So in Indian languages, for example, in the Munda language in the Jharkhandi tribes, there are approximately 5 genders to refer to inanimate objects as well, and animate objects as well. Like they
However, Hindi, which is probably the most spoken, is and the one that I'm referring to, on the whole, is the one that's the most problematic.
So I think Hindi imposition is something that is in the way of gender diversity in India. Having concluded that.
I agree with you on that.
All right, so I think we can go on to our next question now. And I think, Angshu, I would want you to start with this. Does Indian culture excessively promote marginalization of bodies through their countless mythological stories interpreted in popular culture, media, influencing us from a young age?
I don't know so much that it's mythology that does that. But then again, for example, if you read even the Ramayana or Mahabharata, Ramayana mostly, so you come across the demons who are dark and they eat people up and they do all kinds of horrid things. And the key thing to take away from there is that they are dark, right? They are dark, they are not fair-skinned. And I've heard even my own grandmother, right, calling a cousin of mine Rakhoshi, which is, basically a demoness, because she was dark. Unfortunately, we can't seem to have left that behind. And it's a curious mixture of both mythology and our colonial past, because, our colonial masters were fair-skinned people, and they look very different from us. And there's still that aspiration. You have Fair and Lovely, which is now called Glow and Lovely, and stuff like that. It's problematic, and I don't know how long it's going to take to, fight this and kill it ultimately.
So I will just rephrase the question slightly and leave it to the other panelists as well. That is, in general, in culture, there are a number of stories, literature, writing, etc., that comes either through oral traditions or written traditions or visual representations. So in these, usually what happens is there are outdated notions of how of inclusivity, diversity are not really present, then when we are raising children on these stories, etc., then how do we contextualize it to the realities of today's inclusion?
I think it's very difficult. Having a 6.5-year-old son, you know, I know that I don't think I could tell him, say, I could narrate the way my grandmother, say, narrated the Ramayana to me or the Mahabharata. I don't think I could do a pure and simple story based on mythology of good versus evil. I think children now are far more sensitive, and I think they're born that way. I just think that Generation Z has left us way behind. And I don't think he will be very accepting of just that simplicity. I'll make you a small example. Since he's 6.5 and we've been stuck at home, I read stories to him, and I ran out of storybooks, and I bought for the first time a compilation of Enid Blyton stories, Enid Blyton. And after 2 or 3 nights, he kept asking me, "Mommy, do you have anything that actually speaks about the Second World War? I don't want another fairy story, Mommy." So I said, "I'm so sorry. Can you tell me which country started the Second World War?" This is my 6.5-year-old, and I'm ashamed to say I did not know the answer. But I do think that the way we were told stories of our own mythology, I think kids today would question the heck out of those contexts. I do not think they would be willing to take the story of, say, Draupadi and say, "Hey, that sounds normal." So,
Yeah. Bishakh, do you have anything to add?
Well, I can't speak to how to pass on this cultural information to children or whatever, but I will say, as a person who grew up with those kinds of stories as a child, and specifically, I'm thinking of things like the Amar Chitrakatha, the comics and stuff, which are highly problematic, but I think what I've been doing in my work is sort of remixing that cultural information. So there's sort of touchstones in those comics. There are characters that in my book, Apsara Engine, that these sort of archetypes that I've taken and foregrounded them and sort of tilted their trajectories in a way. And I think there are people who are doing that kind of work, like, taking characters like Sita or Draupadi and saying, we're going to tell their stories, but maybe, from their, or we're going to tell an alternate story of Draupadi or something, and I think there's ways of taking that information and making it your own, just like, it's sort of like fan fiction, but I think it becomes something of its own category.
As you were saying, Bishakh, the hybridization, perhaps, of mythology is the way to go.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was just unmuting myself. I think we have one more question, and this is the final question that we have. Now, this is specifically addressed to Aparna, but I think everybody can have a go at it. So I would request maybe somewhere around 2-3 minutes per person, right? And also maybe you could give in your concluding remarks along with that. So the question is that, Aparna,
Yes.
your take on empathy being a factor affecting the fusion of the subject and the object of empathy is fascinating. What other factors do you think would be relevant in this fusion? This is by Gopika Hari. You can start, Aparna, and maybe then we have Bishakh and Angshu.
Okay, hi Gopika. I don't know if I've understood the question properly. Thank you so much. I'm glad you find my perspectives fascinating. Okay, so the kind of what is the word I'm looking for? The flowing of any sort of life experience from one medium to the other, the porosity of two mediums colliding, and actually here, this is where my memory and my word bank just goes for a toss. But the ability of what is it called when capillary action, literally like a capillary action of water flowing from one thing to the other. That porosity, I think, is a very important element of my own storytelling. And I think apart from just having empathy for the other character, that porosity could even cause that capillary action to take place. Even it could just be because you're at the opposite ends of something. So it could be that you become like somebody you loathe the most. So as say anybody, like as Animal Farm would tell you, you tend to take on the characters of those that you despise the most. So you have to watch for that. So it could be that. It could be the capillary action that follows through any relationship where you take on the characters of the person that you are involved with to kind of project their voice. It could even be that you co-opt or you appropriate. It could go to that extent, and that is why I think you have to be careful when you're trying to see that that kind of interplay between two different people or two different, as it were, textures, and how their interplay changes each and every one of them. I think you could even, I think one of the most fascinating things, and one that I'm really looking at exploring in my third novel is the one that is actually between the natural and the supernatural, and how buildings around us, or even anything that is organic around us is absorbing energy from us, and kind of converting it into something completely different, and how it by itself, its nature, its innate nature, is almost epigenetically being changed by that. So yeah, I think that's about as clear as mud. I apologize.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in? Bishakh, Angshu.
Actually, I'm sort of playing with something in that area. For example, in the book that I'm working on now, there's this young girl and an adolescent elephant who basically are, they are in the same accident, and so I try to. So the girl goes back home, and the elephant remains in the forest. But I try to imagine what that moment of shared trauma meant for these two creatures, because after all, we are all creatures. And yeah, I think trauma is a big thing, and we underestimate it. It causes us to become people that people or things that we didn't imagine we ever would become. And yeah, empathy, and yeah, I'd add trauma to that.
This one point that I had over here was that I think empathy individualizes a lot of structure, and what that happens is that you can individually empathize with individuals, but when it comes to speaking to a structure or speaking to power, then it does not translate the same way, right? So I think empathy as a practice is something that is radical. It can be really radical when we talk about the radical politics of self-care, community care, love, and building empathetic relationships as human beings or as people, as animals. I think there it becomes really radical. But when we talk about structure, I think it gets diluted when we talk about empathy and marginalization together in those lines. We have.
I'm sorry, can I just quickly say the word I was looking for was osmosis.
Osmosis.
I am telling you, being perimenopausal is not a vase of flowers.
It's okay. But yeah, so the word was osmosis. We have approximately 5 minutes before we will have to conclude the panel, right? I wanted to keep this time free so that if anybody has anything to conclude with, I would give them that space. Keep them as brief as possible, but just an overview of what you've been saying, maybe.
I guess I'll
Yeah.
say it's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of this. I've lived in the States pretty much all my life, and you know, India for me is like the notion of home is a sort of fractured one for me, and you know, coming on the occasions that I would come back to India, to Kolkata, which is where my folks are from, has always left me with a sort of very strong sense of longing, of yearning, and of nostalgia, even though I've never lived there. So I've always questioned like what it means to be someone like me who's like part of the diaspora. And it's always felt very fragmented, right? But to be included as part of an event like this, and to be included, counted as a writer of South Asian origin and an artist of the same is very affirming for me. So I just wanted to say thank you for having me as part of this. And it's been a long time coming, when, you know, before I could say that I was a writer and an artist, because that's not where I was headed or what I was meant to be at some point in my life. So doing something like this has become, is for me very validating and, you know, a big source of solace and comfort for me, especially in summer of 2020 and the sort of chaos that we find ourselves in. So thank you so much for having me as part of this. And yeah, maybe I'll come back and see you all in person sometime.
Okay, I'll quickly go as well. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Shall I?
No, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I have been so nervous because I really am in awe of all of you guys, and thank you so much for having me. It's, you know, very, very, as Bishakh said, I'm just going to co-opt her words, but yes, it's very affirming for me as well. Again, yes, this was not a journey I thought I would ever undertake. And I think life led me here through a series of traumas and through a series of realizations. And, you know, for me, it's a fairly new career path that I started pretty late in life, but one that I cherish every moment of, specifically because I get to be to be able to speak to people such as you, to have a voice, to be able to have my own agency, is the most enlightening and the most incredible feeling in the world. Let me, just a small thing. I come from a very small town. Growing up, I was taught that a fat girl never wears anything sleeveless, right? Because who wants to look at your arms? And it's the first year of my life I've actually had the guts to do this. And I think this is because of the writers community, and this is because of the tremendous feeling of agency that I now have. And for that, I want to thank Belong. I want to thank each and every one of you, our translators and everybody. Thank you so much. And thank you for reading. Thank you so much for reading.
Thank you. Angshu, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like to first of all thank all of you for first of all putting something like this together. It's incredible what you're doing, and I wish you every success. And it was lovely being on the panel with all of you. Bishakh, Aparna, Sai, it was really lovely speaking to all of you. I look forward to reading your work and perhaps speak again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to all the panelists, Aparna, Angshu, Bishakh, for having participated. This was a very, very fruitful conversation. I'm pretty sure that it was very enriching for all the participants who have been here. And the conversations actually went ahead and addressed a number of varying issues that were both philosophical and literary. And I'm so glad that we were able to do that. Before I end the session, I would like to thank Surbhi and Pinky, who have been translating this into sign language for us. Thank you so much, guys. Really, really glad that you could be here. And yes, that concludes the session. And hopefully we will keep in touch and talk again soon. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye.